Today we will be learning about, in the Parsha of Mitzayra, talks about the healing process, how one goes about to get rid of the tsaras, and then finally, after a period of seclusion, mechutz lamachna, outside of the camp, then the Mitzayra would be seen by the Kohen, and if indeed the tsaras has healed, the Torah prescribes a whole process how to go about being purified. So what do we do? The Kohen, the beginning of Mitzayra says that the Kohen sees that tsaras has been healed, and there's a process where he takes two birds and a piece of some grass and the lobe, excuse me, the crimson wool, and he takes that and a piece of a stick of the cedar tree. As Rashi explains the significance of these various ingredients. The Mitzayra is a person who spoke Lashon Hara, so there's an element of haughtiness and arrogance, symbolized by the cedar, as well as at this point they should be feeling a certain element of humility, symbolized and embodied by the grass and the worm, which gives off that crimson the crimson color. And he goes through a whole process how they slaughter the bird and they dip it and they dip it in and so on. So I'm going to jump over and talk about how afterwards, after a 7-day seclusion period, the Kohen would make sure that he was totally clean. He would clean his clothes, he would shave his hair and so on, and then he would bring a carbon, a special sacrifice that the Mitzayra would have to bring. On the 8th day, the Torah says he should bring, and this is a Parsha Mitzayra, in the beginning, on Parak Yudal, Pasuk Yud, he says, Bayem Hashmini, Yikach Shnei Kvasim. He would take 2 male lambs, Tmimim, they're complete, V'kavs Achas, and a female lamb, and they would bring this carbon. However, and there was a whole process how they would sprinkle the blood and so on. But later, in Pasuk Chav Aleph, the Torah says that is the case if the person is of means, has financial ability. Pasuk Chav Aleph says, V'imdalhu, v'in yadim aseges, if this is a person who is poor and is not in the financial position to be able to afford these offerings that were mentioned before, so then there's other options available. He could bring one. Instead, in the case of the carbon chatas, he would bring a meal offering. So ultimately, what we see from all of this, the Mitzayra, the carbon that he brought, was what's known as the carbon oil of the Yored. It was a sliding scale of sorts based on the financial means and ability of the person. That would determine exactly what kind of sacrifice. If the person was of means, was a wealthy person, he would bring a carbon that corresponded to his financial status, whereas if the person was poor, he would bring a more meager, more humble, simple sacrifice. Now, the Rambam tells us that a fascinating thing. He says there is a concept that a person is allowed to sponsor, is allowed to offer, to bring the sacrifice on behalf of another person. So say this person, Reuven, was a Mitzayra, and he went through the whole process and was healed, and now it's time for him to bring a sacrifice. And his friend Shimon says, it's on me, I'm going to bring your sacrifice. So it is a process that is permitted. This is certainly an option, and Shimon could bring the sacrifice on behalf of Reuven. Now, in light of the fact that we said that the carbon is income tested based on how much you make, what your means are, so here's the question: who do we look towards? Do we look at Reuven's financial abilities, or do we look at Shimon's income level? So the Rambam says like this. He says that in the instance that Shimon takes upon himself to bring a sacrifice of the Karban Mitzayra on behalf of Reuven, so here's what happens. Let's say Reuven was a poor person and Shimon was a wealthy person. Now, of course, if they're both poor, it's obvious they bring up that Shimon's sacrifice would be for a poor person. They're both poor. If they're both rich, of course, again, it would be clear that Shimon would have to bring the sacrifice that corresponds to the wealthy person. What's unclear is what happens if one is rich and the other is poor. So the Rambam sets it out like this. If Shimon was wealthy and Reuven was poor, that is to say the Mitzorah is poor, but the sponsor of the Karban Shimon was wealthy. So in this instance, the Rambam says the Shimon has to bring a sacrifice that is of the level of the rich person. The Rambam says ultimately, yes, the Mitzorah may have been poor, but you Shimon are rich, and therefore you have to bring a rich man's sacrifice. But based on this, it would seem that what is the threshold? How do we view the whole thing? What's important to us is we don't look at the Mitzorah. We don't look at the person who suffered, who was the victim. It's not relevant to us what the financial status or situation is of the Mitzorah. We look at the sponsor. We look at the person who is the donor, who's going to bring the sacrifice. If he is rich, he brings a rich man's sacrifice. Even if the Mitzorah, the person who is bringing it for, is poor. However, then the Rambam provides another statement which seems to contradict this first statement. He says, let's say the situation was reversed. Let's say the Mitzorah, Reuven, was a wealthy person. Shimon, his friend, was a poor person. And the poor person, Shimon, declared that he is donating, he's sponsoring the sacrifice for Reuven, the Mitzorah. But Shimon is poor. Does Shimon bring a poor man's sacrifice, or does he bring a wealthy man's sacrifice? Here, surprisingly, the Rambam says, Shimon, even though he is poor, he has to bring a rich, wealthy man's sacrifice. Because the Rambam says, at the end of the day, he is bringing the sacrifice on behalf of the Mitzorah. Mitzorah is rich, is wealthy. So here, now if we look at these two statements of the Rambam, these two rulings, they seem to conflict with each other. On the one hand, we mentioned before, if the Mitzorah was poor and the donor, the sponsor was rich, and the rich person wants to bring a sacrifice on behalf of the Mitzorah, what do we say? We say if the sponsor is wealthy, he has to bring a rich man's sacrifice. It seems clear from here that we look solely at the sponsor's status. Is he rich? He has to bring a rich man's sacrifice. And yet, in the second ruling, in the instance where the Mitzorah was rich and the sponsor, Shimon, was poor, here it would seem, based on the initial ruling, that here he should bring a poor man's sacrifice, because that is the sponsor. Seemingly, we should be looking at the sponsor status, and the status of the sponsor is that he's poor. Yet, the Torah says, the Rambam rules that even, albeit that the sponsor is poor, he has to bring a rich man's sacrifice. This is the statement in the Rambam and the laws of Mechusri Kapara, those who require sacrifices that require atonement. This is a conflict in the Rambam. The Rebbe addressed this seeming contradiction in a talk in the year 1985, and he also brought other statements of the Rambam that seem to conflict, but we will sort of keep our discussion focused here on this basic idea. And the explanation that the Rebbe gave was a fascinating insight into not just the Rambam and what seems to be maybe just an intricate law in the laws of Tsaras and the laws of sacrifices, Korbanos, but actually it teaches us a very fundamental principle in how to look at life, how to to educate children, how to view ourselves in general. What's interesting, and we'll get to it later, this talk of the Rebbe that he gave in 1985 was at the end of Tishrei. It was after a month, all of the guests that came from all over the world to join the Rebbe throughout Tishrei. Before they would leave, the Rebbe would give a special talk to these orchim, to these guests. And the Rebbe at that point was talking about the phenomenon of all of the people who were together for an entire month, celebrating, dancing and singing and living all the high moments of Tishrei. And as they were about to leave, the Rebbe quoted this Rambam as giving a very, very profound insight and perspective how to continue in their journey, going back to their homes and remaining inspired. So we'll get back to that in a moment. First, we need to address this burning issue, this Rambam over here. We need to understand how this works. Do we look at the means of the sponsor? Do we look at the means and the status of the Metzora? How are we to reconcile these two conflicting statements? So what the Rebbe says is like this. Ultimately, what we have here in this concept of a person being able to donate or sponsor a sacrifice on behalf of their fellow Jew, what we have here is two elements. There are two things that are going on. When Shimon comes along and says, I want to sponsor a sacrifice on behalf of my fellow Jew, on behalf of my friend Reuven, there are two components, there are two issues that need to be addressed. Number one, what's happening here is that Shimon is making a neder, he's making a vow. Like any person, a person comes along and says, I want to make this contribution, I want to make this donation, I am making an oath or a vow that something will be done. So you need to fulfill your vow. You need to do exactly what you said. That's point number one, and that's obvious. You make a vow, you need to fulfill your vow. But there's something else that's happening here when you take upon yourself to bring a sacrifice or to offer or to sponsor the sacrifice on behalf of someone else. In addition to the vow that you're making, as we mentioned before, when we talk about a Metzora, this whole process of bringing a sacrifice was a culmination of the purification, the healing, and ultimately atonement, kapara, for the Metzora. As we mentioned before, this Metzora engaged in Lashon Hara, engaged in all kinds of, we're not going to get into the whole pathology and the diagnosis of the spiritual malaise of the Metzora, but ultimately, clearly, there's some spiritual healing that needs to take place, some rehabilitation, and atonement. It's kapara. So what has to happen here is, in addition to just bringing a sacrifice, this sacrifice would be the culmination, it would be the completion of the atonement of the Metzora. So what we have here is the person saying, I am going to bring the carbon on this person's behalf. There's a vow that has to be fulfilled, and there's atonement that needs to be achieved. So what do? When we look at when Shimon comes along and says, I am sponsoring the carbon on Reuven's behalf. So let's look at the first aspect, the first component, which is the vow. Shimon said, I am bringing this Metzora's sacrifice. In this instance, he has to bring the exact sacrifice that the Metzora would bring. If that is the case, in the instance where Reuven was rich, even if Shimon was poor, it doesn't matter that he is a poor person. We don't care about the status of Shimon, the sponsor. You need to look at the status of the Metzora. Because if you make a vow and say, I'm bringing this person's sacrifice, I'm bringing Reuven's sacrifice. What was Reuven's sacrifice? You'd have to bring whatever sacrifice Reuven would bring on in his own right. So if Reuven was rich, he would bring a rich sacrifice. If he was poor, he would bring a poor man's carbon. So therefore, in reality, we should not be looking at the status of Shimon, the sponsor. You have to be looking at the status of the Metzora, sufferer, the person who actually was going to bring that carbon on his own. That's one point. But on the other hand, what's happening here, as we mentioned, there's a dimension of kapara, of atonement, of healing. What's amazing here is that Shimon, the sponsor, is able to offer a sacrifice to achieve atonement. But what's happening here is there's a certain merging, there's a certain unity that's happening here, where Shimon is able to offer a sacrifice and achieve atonement on behalf of Reuven, which is a very, very powerful and deep idea. Because on the face of it, if I did something wrong, I have to make up for it. I have to make amends. I have to seek forgiveness. How does someone else do that for me? But here we have a powerful idea. The idea is that we know that all Jews are, in the words of the Yerushalmi, we're conceived as being one entity, one organism. There may be many limbs, there are many, many different parts of the body, different organs, different sinews, veins, many limbs, but we are one body. And as such, that many, many Jewish people, as diverse as we may be, ultimately, we constitute one whole body as a Jewish people. Thus, Kol Yisrael Arevim Ze B'Ze, we are all integrated, we are guarantors for each other. As we mentioned in the past, this concept that all Jewish people, regardless of where they come from, whether they know each other, there's a concept of arvos, this guarantorship through which we can fulfill a mitzvah. So, for example, when one person wants to make kiddush, he can be motzi many, many people. And to a further extent, even if the person already made kiddush, right? And the people who are there in the audience don't know how to make kiddush on their own. Nevertheless, the person who already made kiddush can make kiddush on their behalf with a bracha. Now, what's the logic? What's the rationale? I already made kiddush. How can I be motzi somebody else? Because halacha says, since they have a duty, they have a chiyuv, they have an obligation to hear kiddush. Even if I already heard kiddush, the fact that they didn't hear kiddush means, to a certain degree, I'm lacking in my kiddush, and therefore I can be motzi them. That is the concept of arvus. That's in the positive. How about in the negative? So we know part of the davening every single day, we say Ashamnu, Bagadnu. There's the section of Tachnun that we say in the davening, Ashamnu, Bagadnu. I have sinned, I have transgressed, I have been guilty, and so on. And the famous question Chassidus asks is, okay, I understand an average person says Ashamnu, Bagadnu. How about Tzaddikim? How about the holiest rabbis, big Rebbeim? They say Ashamnu, Bagadnu, Gazalnu, Dibarnu David. Seemingly, they spoke Lashon Hara, Chas v'Shalom. How could they say, and why are they saying every single day Ashamnu, Bagadnu? So on one level, it's explained in Chassidus that even tzaddikim, there's levels of tshuva, right? We know that what you did yesterday is insufficient for what you need to do today. Every day we need to grow. We have to constantly strive higher and do more. So perhaps on one level, in regards to what I did yesterday, it's insufficient, and you have to constantly do tshuva. As it says, when Mashiach comes, even the tzaddikim will do tshuva. But here we have a deeper level. The deeper level here is Ashamnu Bagadnu, is that since all Jewish people are interconnected, we're interdependent. So therefore, yes, maybe I might be a tzaddik, I might be the most righteous person, but so long as that there's another Jew that needs atonement, that has done something wrong, that therefore I am lacking, I am missing, it pulls me down. It makes me less to the extent that I need to rectify, I need to improve. Because that person needs improvement, I need improvement. And this is ultimately what lies behind this ruling, this concept that a person is not just taking a vow and saying, hey, I'm going to sponsor this person's sacrifice. It's like, I'm going to sponsor the Kiddush this Shabbos. That's nice. That's a donation. You're making you're sponsoring something towards something holy. So that's one level. But on a deeper level, what's happening here is also, in addition to just this sponsorship, there's what's really happening here? There's a sacrifice to atone, to give kapara for this mitzvah. And Shimon right now is saying, I am going to bring that carbon and I will receive the atonement on that person's behalf. That could only happen when we merge to the extent that we all become one. There's no distinction between me and you. Yes, you may have spoken Lashon Hara, but I am affected by it. I need kapara because you spoke Lashon Hara, and therefore I am sponsoring your carbon on your behalf, but it's not really on your behalf, it's really on my behalf. If that's the case, if you're sponsoring a carbon on someone else's behalf, but it's really on your behalf, so now, if you're a wealthy person, you cannot bring a poor man's carbon, even if the mitzvah was poor, because at the end of the day, if you're achieving atonement for yourself, even though it's on that person's behalf, but the only way you could achieve atonement is if your identities have been totally merged. You identify so much that you and that person are truly one. So it is you that needs atonement. If you need atonement, you cannot bring that person's financial status. Who cares if the mitzvah is poor? You're wealthy, you're rich. If you're rich, you cannot bring a mitzvah's carbon. The mitzvah's carbon who is poor. So to recap, as confusing as it may seem, on the one hand, if you, the sponsor, are poor, but that person is wealthy, it is insufficient to bring a poor man's carbon. Because, as we mentioned before, you pledged, you promised, you said, I'm going to bring that mitzvah's carbon. So from the laws of vows, of neder, we can't look at the donors, at the sponsor's financial status, because you promised to bring the mitzvah's carbon. And that mitzvah, if he was going to bring it, he would bring a rich man's, in the instance that the mitzvah is rich, he would bring a rich man's carbon. So we cannot look at the donor's financial status, we have to look at the status of the mitzvah. The mitzvah is rich, the poor man, sponsor, needs to bring a rich man's carbon. And we're going to address that phenomenon in a second, how that's even possible. But suffice it to say, at this point, in the instance when the donor is poor, we still look at the mitzvah to see what is his financial status. Because from the laws of neder, what's important is what would the mitzvah have brought? If the mitzvah would have brought a rich man's carbon, that is the carbon the poor man has to bring. However, in the instance where the sponsor was wealthy and their mitzvah is poor, yes, from the laws of neder, from the laws of vow, it would be sufficient to bring a poor man's carbon because that's the carbon that you pledge to bring for the poor person. But if you are to achieve atonement on behalf of the mitzvah, that can only happen when you and the mitzvah have become one. Because if you're not one, how indeed can you bring atonement? How can you achieve atonement on someone else's behalf? If your teacher gives you when my kids, they're in the class, they get these assignments, right? Never happens to my kids. Let's say somebody else's kids. They were speaking without derech eretz, and they have to write lines. They have to write the assignments, right? The kid has to write it. What would happen if another kid would come along? And I remember when I was in school, that was a business. Kids would write assignments, and they would sell them to the kids, and then they would give it to the teacher. Would that be okay? At the end of the day, they're bringing the kid is delivering to the teacher the same assignment. Derech Eretz Kadmon LaTorah 2,000 times. He paid $20 for it, and now he gives it to the teacher. At the end of the day, it's nice and everything that the words were written, but the teacher didn't just want 20 sheets of paper with the assignment written out. What he wanted was the kid should sit and have remorse and regret and feel bad and become a better kid. How does it help that someone else wrote the assignment for him? And seemingly that's what's happening here. This mitzvah needs a kapara, he needs atonement. And what's happening? Someone else is bringing a carbon on his behalf. How does that happen? The Shimon doesn't need atonement, Reuven needs atonement. But what's happening here is Shimon and Reuven are one. They are the same. And therefore, if Reuven needs atonement, Shimon needs atonement. So if Shimon needs atonement, If that is the case, then Shimon needs to bring a carbon based on his status. If he is rich, how can he bring a poor man's carbon? And therefore, the halacha is, if the sponsor was wealthy, he brings a wealthy person's carbon. So the Rebbe concludes and he says that what we have here is two things. We see two amazing concepts. Number one, we see this idea of Avas Yisrael, this concept that because I love another Jew, I can bring that person's carbon, right? I pledge and I say, I want to bring his carbon. And as we mentioned before, what you're doing here is you're achieving atonement on that person's behalf. We see how the Jews are so united and so unified and integrated that what goes on in that other person's life is not just of a concern to me, it impacts me, it affects me in a very profound and deep way, to the extent I can achieve atonement on another person's behalf. Very, very, very powerful, very, very deep idea. And we've spoken about this many times, how this impacts us in many, many ways, and how this concept, it's not just, well, we should be nosy and know what's going on in another person's life, what people are up to, what they're doing. In fact, everything that happens in their life, it impacts us. Similar to the story of that the Rashbi brings of the people who are on the boat that was traveling, and this person's drilling his hole underneath his seat, and everyone in the boat starts saying, "Hey, what are you doing?" And the person says, "What do you care? It's none of your business. I purchased the seat. I could do whatever I want with my seat." And he proceeds to drill this hole under a seat. And everyone says, "Well, it's very nice that it's your seat, but if you continue to drill a hole, we are all going to drown." Because ultimately, the actions of one person impact and affect everyone in a very deep way. And this is true also in the positive, that the positive things that we do, the mitzvahs that we do, for schus for another person, when a person's not well, or in general, brachas, davening, things that we do are able to heal, are able to uplift people in our communities, in our families, and so on. But I want to touch on the second point that the Rebbe brings up, which is profound in another way. And that's going back to this halacha, this concept, that in the instance where Shimon, the sponsor, was poor, but the mitzorer was rich, the sponsor needs to bring, even though he is a poor person, since he took upon himself, he pledged to pay the carbon of the mitzorer, even though the sponsor is poor, since the mitzorer is rich, he has to bring a rich man's carbon. The Rebbe says, what does that mean? I mean, at the end of the day, this guy's poor. What do you want from him? And here the Rebbe lays down a very, very powerful idea. And he says, bottom line, since this sponsor, since Shimon, the hypothetical Shimon, he comes along and says, I am sponsoring this person's carbon, this person's sacrifice, even though he is poor, but that mitzorer was wealthy, the Torah now already views this sponsor, already views Shimon as being wealthy. And at the end of the day, the Torah views him as wealthy. He will view himself as wealthy. And ultimately, he will have the means to be able to step up and pay the status of the carbon that has the status of the rich person, even though it would seem to be beyond his means. The Rebbe brings a story in that Sikha from the Frierdiker Rebbe, that the Frierdiker Rebbe at one point, he wanted to print the tshuvas, the responsa of the Tzemach Tzedek, which at that point was a big financial undertaking. And the Rebbe summoned a chassid to take upon himself to sponsor, to pay, to undertake the printing of the tshuvas, of these responsa of the Tzemach Tzedek. And at that person said, Rebbe, listen, it's a great idea, it's a great project, but why me? I do not have the ability to take this on. This is way beyond my ability, it's beyond my means. But the chassid heard the Rebbe gave him a bracha, and he took it upon himself. And ultimately, the person in this person's life, all of a sudden, new opportunities, new things opened up, and within a short period of time became a tremendously successful and affluent person and the tshuvas, the response of the Tzemach Tzedek were printed. The Frierdiker Rebbe said at that point, when I asked that chassid to print those tshuvas, to print that responsa, he truly did not have the ability. It was way beyond his means. It was something way out of reach. But since that person took upon themselves to that undertaking, even though at that point it was way beyond his reach, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. New channels, new conduits were opened up to this person. And then all of a sudden, that energy, that hashpa'ah came from Hashem, and he was able to take it on. So what the Rebbe is saying over here is that at the end of the day, what matters here sometimes is not necessarily the way things really are. At the end of the day, the question is, how do we view ourselves? Do we view ourselves as wealthy? Do we view ourselves as poor? This is not just in finances, which clearly that's what we're talking about. And that's the halacha. Halacha is that a person takes upon themselves that donation, that sacrifice, they all of a sudden will have the means. That poor person will have the means to bring that rich man's sacrifice. But we're also talking in many other, the ramifications of this idea affect many, many other areas. And I'll mention a few. In that sicha, the Rebbe was talking to the Archim. As we mentioned earlier, the Rebbe was talking to the guests that came to Crown Heights to spend the month of Tishrei with the Rebbe. And at that point, the Archim were about to leave. It was at the end of Tishrei. And as often is, many times for Hasidim, it's not easy being with the Rebbe and seeing the blowing of the shofar and Yom Kippur, Ne'ilah, shaking lulav. It's Simchas Torah. It's a high energy month and lots of inspiration. And then they leave. So the Rebbe was telling them like this, and he quotes this Rambam and the ruling and the insight, the explanation as we mentioned before. And then he says like this. At this point, all of the Hasidim, they're about to return to their homes. And we're talking about Orchim guests that came from Israel, they came from France, they came from Australia, they came from all over the world. Rabbi said, during the month, we were all together ba'achdus, with unity. And now, where each person is embarking on their own journey, on their own path, going back home to do their own thing. So this would seemingly lend itself to the very opposite of achdus. There's a fragmentation, a dispersion. Everyone's going back to their own place. But however, if each and every single one of us in our minds maintain that we are not fragmented, we are not in a state of disunity, we are in a state of achdus, that we are still truly together, even if we are in all different places, it doesn't matter where we are physically. The question is, in our mind, where are we? Rebbe quoted the Gemara that says that we know famously that machshava tova HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitzaref l'maisa. Sometimes people have good intentions, they have great ambitions, aspirations, they have great ideas, great dreams and goals, but sometimes it doesn't actually come to fruition, doesn't come to actuality. They want to do a great thing, they want to help a person, they really, really try it, but it doesn't materialize. Nevertheless, this machshava tova, this good intention, Hashem mitzaref l'maisa. So generally, we translate that. Listen, you meant well, and Hashem considers as if it was done. Right? It's maybe you didn't. You wanted to eat that matzah. You thought you were going to go shake lulav that person. You were going to put on tefillin, or you're going to give out those Shabbos candles to that person. You wanted something great to happen. It just never happened. You were sick. You were tired. You couldn't find the person. Who knows? Whatever the reason was. So we say Hashem deems as if you did it. That's one level. That's one way of looking at it. But a deeper pshat is HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitzaref l'maisa Hashem. If you have that machshava tova, if you have that good intent, so then Hashem actually combines that intent to bring it to maisa. He actually makes it happen. He deems it that he will create and precipitate all kinds of events that it should ultimately come to fruition. And indeed, that's what makes all the difference. if we have that proper perspective, we have that proper insight, then ultimately, the Rebbe said, if you think you're ba'achtus, right, you may be going all over the world. If you, in your mind, we look, and the Rebbe quoted this Rambam, he says, we see from this Rambam that at the end of the day, if you see yourself as rich, if you see yourself as wealthy, you are wealthy. If you think you are in a state of achtus, if you think you're all together, indeed, you are truly together. Which certainly is a very, very powerful perspective how we should look at these times, where it would seem, at least on a superficial reading of events, how things are unfolding here as communities, as families, we all are in a state where we appear to be totally fragmented and isolated, distant from each other. But the question is that how we really, if we really, really internalize that message? Is that what we've become? We've become truly fragmented. We've become isolated from each other. If we, and certainly technology helps this, if we, in our minds, we are truly together and we make every effort to be together, that's all that matters. So I think that's one takeaway from this Rambam. But there's also the way the Rebbe explained this idea. It teaches us very much how we have to view ourselves, how we have to view our children, how we have to view our students. Because if what matters most is how we view things, how we have to look at things. So if the way we view ourselves and the way we view our children, it's very, very important. Because one of the struggles, one of the challenges that we often encounter, the way to view ourselves and the way we view others, it could be two ways. Naturally, it seems that we are always gravitating to look at the negative, or at the, not necessarily the success of something. It could be in our lives, we look at things that we do, or things that we wanted to do, and we weren't able to accomplish them. The same thing is with our children. Same thing is with our students. We could look at their successes. We could look at their failures. And for some reason, I was recently reading a book by Rabbi Twersky, talking about parenting, and he says that for some reason, there is the natural tendency as parents or as students or as teachers, we look at our children, and we're very, very good, he says, at catching them at doing something wrong. He says, well, you'll catch the kid, they'll put something, a cookie into their mouth, and say, did you make a bracha? Did you make a bracha? Or we see them in shul or in another place. Naturally, they could do a million things that are right, that are good, that are positive, and it just slides right by. But it's the one or sometimes it could be the one thing that they don't do right, and we right away latch onto that. So in the instance of them eating something, we'll say, did you make a bracha? But how about the fact when they do make a bracha, do we say amen? And with excitement and passion, approving, affirming the good things that they did. It says, why is it that many of us, we are always quick to see the negative, or always detect, we're always on alert to see if they did something wrong, but not necessarily the positive things, the things that they did right. And he says that this is a very, very important aspect, because ultimately it is the person's self-esteem. It is our own self-esteem, it is our children's, our students' self-esteem, the way their own self-image, the way we look at ourselves and the way they look at themselves is the most important factor. And certainly this is the case, because if they come home with a report card and there's many things in there, some things we may like, some things we may not be too happy about. Our natural tendency would be, oh, I see your mark went down, or you only got a C in Chumash, or you got a B in halacha, or in math, or spelling. What's important is, instead of pointing out their failures, is to point out the things that they did right, the things that they did good. even if it's something that, even if many of the main subjects, many of the main important things, they need a lot of improvement. We find one good thing, one positive thing that they actually did good and right. I see your cleanliness, your neatness, your music, your something, anything it is that's actually good. Because what happens here is, at the end of the day, if we highlight, if we accentuate the things that they need to fix, the things that they are not good at, the things that are not so positive, ultimately, how are the kids going to view themselves? They're going to see themselves as a failure. Because we view them as a failure, they will view themselves as a failure. However, if we are going to see the positive, we're going to actually see something good. Say, wow, Moishele, Yankele, wow, I see you cleaned your room, you did this. We find something. You made such beautiful bracha. We actually find a success story about them and highlight and emphasize that positive, that success. So once we underscore that positive, then the kids will view themselves as a success. And then the success will breed, will grow on itself. Ultimately, it will make a difference, because sometimes the way we view ourselves is the way we view others. And if we don't feel like a success, if we feel like a failure, if we're constantly having that negative self-image, if we don't feel rich, as we know, the Talmud tells us, Ein ani ela b'das, true wealth, true richness is not physical money. It's about knowledge. It's about how we view ourselves. If our mind is filled with learning, with ideas, with positive things, we are truly wealthy. So the question is, how do we view ourselves? The Torah is telling us a very powerful lesson here. If we view ourselves as a success, if we are able to train and to discipline ourselves to the extent that we always think of the positive and the good things, indeed, it's not just a segula, some good omen. It actually will have a very, very powerful impact and will bring out, will activate that aspect of ourselves. I believe I said the story before, the famous story of the Alter Rebbe. He was once with a group of his colleagues. They were raising funds for Pidyon Shvuyim. There was a family that was in captivity, as was those days. People didn't pay their rent. And he goes with a group of these colleagues to raise the funds. They asked the Alter Rebbe, could you help us? Could you raise the funds? And Alter Rebbe says, I'll join you, but only on one condition. The condition is that you can't question any of my decisions. Whatever I ask you to do, you're going to follow unquestionably. And they agreed. So they pull out the list of the donors, of all the shimons, and the Alter Rebbe right away picks one name, says, we're going to this guy first. They say, this guy, he is a miser. You'll be lucky if you get a rusty penny from that guy. Alter Rebbe says, okay, listen, we made a deal. You're not going to question me, or I'm out. They said, okay, if this is what you want to do, this is what we'll do. So they go to the person's house, they knock on the door, and the person opens up, Shalom Aleichem, welcome. And they come inside, how can I help you? So the Alter Rebbe begins, he tells the story. There's a person, a family, an almana with children. They're thrown into the dungeon by the pirates. It's a case of Pidyon Shvuyim. It's a very, very serious situation. We need to raise 5,000 rubles. So the person, this wealthy person, says, I see. Goes to the back, brings his little velvet pouch, and he pulls out, indeed, a rusty penny. And he gives it to the Alter Rebbe. And he says, here, should be Batzlacha. Alter Rebbe takes it, and he smiles, and he says, Yasher Koyach, thank you so much. Tizkul mitzvahs, and he writes him a whole receipt with brachas. You should be gesund, and your family, a whole bracha. And these people, his friend, the people the Gabayim that went with him, they're seething, they're angry. And Alter Rebbe takes the penny, he puts it in his pocket, and they walk out the door. And they're angry, and they say, we shouldn't have gone, we knew it. As they're walking away, the door opens up again, and the guy calls them back, says, come back. I have to ask you something. And they all come back, they go back to the house, and he says, sit down, tell me again, what was the story? What's the crisis over here? Alter Rebbe tells the whole story of the almana and the Yisraimim and a prison and Pidyon Shvuyim. How much money do you need again? I need 5,000 rubles. Let me see what I could do. He goes to the back, comes back, and he says, oh, let me give you, here's 1,000 rubles. Well, the Alter Rebbe says, thank you very much, very warm, with more brachas and more the thank yous and so on. And these people can't believe it, and they start to leave, and they walk out the door. They're walking away, and then all of a sudden the door opens up again. And the guy says, please, Rabbi Isai, please come back. I have to ask you something. And he sits down and he says, here, tell me, how much again do you need? What was the story? And the Alter Rebbe says the story, and he says, we need 5,000 rubles. He says, I am going to give you the entire amount. And he goes to the back and he gives them the entire 5,000 rubles. And he says, I want you to know that for many, many years, I haven't given tzedakah. When I was much younger, I wasn't wealthy, I was a poor person. But I too wanted to give tzedakah. And one day, when I was very poor, a poor person came over to me. All I had was a rusty penny. And I took out this rusty penny and I gave it to, I had a penny actually. It wasn't even rusty in those days. And I gave it to this person, and the poor person was so disgusted. He was so not impressed with my donation, and he threw it back in my face. And I made a pledge to myself at that time that I'm never going to give tzedakah again until someone takes this penny from me. Years and years have gone by. Mshulachim, Gabayim from all over the world have come to me for money, but I never got anyone to accept this coin until you came today. But now that you've taken it, I am truly, truly gratified and validated, and I'm very, very happy to give you the full amount. When the Rebbe left, he tells his Gabayim, he says, listen, you see over here, this person, his whole life, he never really trained himself to give tzedakah. He wanted to give, maybe he had goodness in his heart, but so long that no one took it, they did not validate him. And therefore, we had to train him. We had to literally evoke within him feelings of chesed, of generosity, until he was able to work up within himself the ability to give the full amount, which he had. But he was never able to be in that position, that state of mind to give tzedakah. And I think this story illustrates that each and every one of us, in some way or another, have a rusty penny. We have within us talents, abilities, resources, skills. Our children have it, our students have it. But oftentimes, people look at them and all they see is the rusty penny. They just see the negative and they throw it back in their face, throw it back in our face. And if that is what happens, it becomes an unfortunate, vicious cycle, because then people see them as negative. They view themselves as negative and failures, and they're never able to be the successful, optimistic person and achieve what they're truly capable of achieving. So sometimes, as hard as it may be, when we look at ourselves, when we look at our children, to be able to see something positive, to see something good. And if we do that, if we're truly able to do that, then we look at them as wealthy, they will see themselves as wealthy. And so that's my bracha to each and every one of us. We should be able to see ourselves in the most positive light, in our most pristine and successful state. And when we do that, we realize there's potential, there's abilities that we can unleash that we didn't know about. And may it be Hashem's will, we should all live up to that tremendous potential. And when we do that, indeed, we inspire ourselves, we inspire those around us. And as the Rebbe says in the Sikha over there, we are all in a state of unity. We are together, even when things are challenging, when things are not so great. If we maintain that achdus in our minds, in our hearts, then we are truly together in every sense of the way. So I'll now unmute all of you. If anyone has any questions or any comments, you are welcome to do so. And Emirz Hashem, next week, Sunday morning, 10 o'clock, we will resume. Be'ezer Hashem, with Hashem's help.
Amen. Thank you.
Okay. So I unmuted everyone. If anyone has any questions, the floor is yours. And those, if someone has a question and I can't hear them, they could type it.
I'm good.
All right. Shavua Tov, everyone. It was Marsha's question. How is your brother doing? Thank you for the question. Baruch Hashem, recently there's been some very positive and significant improvements. And Mirz Hashem, he's on the road to recovery. And we should continue with our tefillos, with our tehillim, with our davening. It's very much appreciated. Avram Meir, Hakayan Ben Aliza. But Baruch Hashem, we are hearing very good reports, and we hope to continue to hear them. And B'soich Shar Chayil Yisrael, we should hear Refuah Shlema for everyone, all of those who need healing and need brachas. Okay, it seems like everyone, there's no further questions. So I'm going to sign off, and Mirz Hashem, we will see you next week, 10 o'clock, Sunday morning.